Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Artemis Kirk, University Librarian, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome so many of you to the Ellen Catherine Gstalder Memorial Lecture for 2016. It's nice to see so many library associates and alumni here, and even nicer to see so many students. We're delighted, and I know that one of the goals of this lecture for the Gstalder family is that students will come, so it's very nice to have you here. Excuse me. This program was established in memory of Ellen Gstalder, a 1998 graduate of Georgetown College, by her family to honor Ellen's concern for social justice issues in the United States. Ellen joined Teach for America upon graduation and was assigned to a D.C. public school in Anacostia. She remained at the school after her 2-year commitment and planned to teach 1 or 2 more years, go to graduate school, and reform either the education system or the nutrition available to poor children, both of which very much appalled her. Very sadly, Ellen became ill in the fall of her 3rd teaching year and was unable to continue. She obtained, however, a professional chef certificate and was accepted into a New York University master's program in public health education before she passed away in 2004. The Gstalder family's generosity has enabled us to continue Ellen's legacy at Georgetown by hosting thought-provoking speakers whose ideas and work provide insight and focus on significant social, economic, and educational issues in America, which is what Ellen would have worked toward. Herb and Bobby Gstalder, won't you please stand so we can acknowledge your kindness in endowing this lecture series to us. Before I introduce our speakers for the evening, I want to thank the library staff members who are the ones who arranged this program and made everything possible tonight. Amy Richards, David Hagan, Grace McKinney, Katie Thomas, and Zainab Chelik. Thank you all. And now, I have the pleasure to introduce you to our speakers for the evening, Mark Mazzetti and Phil Klay. Mazzetti has covered national security issues for the New York Times from the newspaper's Washington bureau since 2006. He is the author of The Way of the Knife, The CIA, A Secret Army, and a War at the Ends of the Earth, a New York Times bestseller in 2000. And in 2009, he shared a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the intensifying violence in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Washington's response. Mazzetti received the 2011 Polk Award with colleague Dexter Filkins for coverage of Afghanistan and Pakistan videotapes and was recently awarded the 2015 Polk Award as part of a team of 7 New York Times journalists who investigated the hidden history of the Navy's SEAL teams. Phil Klay is a Marine Corps veteran of the Iraq War and the author of the short story collection Redeployment, which received the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction, the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Award for Best Debut Work in Any Genre, the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation's James Webb Award for Fiction dealing with U.S. Marines or Marine Corps life, the American Library Association's W.I. Boyd Literary Award for Excellence in Military Fiction, the Chautauqua Prize, and the 2015 Warwick Prize for Writing. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mark Mazzetti and Phil Klay.
Thank you very much, Artemis. And Phil and I have discussed how to arrange things tonight and thought that the best way to tailor our remarks was to do it in the vein of political discourse in America these days. I'm going to open by questioning Phil's eligibility to be president, planting the seed that he may not have been born in this country. Phil's then going to attack me personally, my background and my tendency to sweat profusely. And then we're going to open it up for questions, but then relentlessly mock the question and the person who asked it. And then we're going to call it a night. Thankfully, we're not going to do that. And it's a great honor to be here tonight and to give with Phil the Ellen Catherine Gstalder Lecture. So thank you to the Gstalder family and to Georgetown for inviting us here. And it's also a great honor to do it here with Phil, whose work I admire greatly, and someone with whom I share a few things in common. Both of us are graduates of Regis High School in New York City. And any Regis graduates here? Oh, one, two. Good to see you. And we also share the same book editor at Penguin Press, Scott Moyers. It was a couple years ago, I met Scott in New York for a drink, and he proudly pulled out a copy of The Galleys of Phil's book. And he put it down on the table, and he said, "This guy went to your high school, and he wrote a damn good book." And he was right. And those of you, I imagine some of you are here tonight because you've read Redeployment, and those of you who not, you should. But I think that being with Phil tonight to talk about some of these issues, I think will be I think a good complexity to some of these issues, both from someone who's covered as a journalist and someone who has written about it in a fiction capacity, but also who, as a Marine, lived it. So tonight we're here to talk about war, but it's a war that looks different from what people are used to. For lack of a better term, we're here to talk about shadow wars, which are different than people think about what people think about the wars in our history as a country, but also different than more recent history in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nearly 4 years ago, actually just over 4 years ago, in a second inaugural address, President Obama said pointedly that a decade of war is coming to an end. What he was talking about was the public wars, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that we've come to know so well. And then in a speech in May of that year, in 2013, he said that this other war, the war on terrorism, is going to have to end at some point. And the government, our government, is going to have to be more transparent about it. And yet, 4 years later, the war continues, and there's really little indication yet that that new era of transparency is coming. What President Obama talked about in 2013 about the tides of war receding, in fact, in many ways, the opposite has happened. The tide has come back in. And what we've seen now come to realize in the past couple of years is that we're in this sort of state of semi-permanent war. And a type of warfare that I think has proved seductive, both to American politicians and to the president, two successive presidents actually, one Republican and one Democrat, because of the American experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the secret wars that the United States has been waging for the past 15 years don't show any signs of ending. And it's a war that has created a new model for how we as a country decide to go to war. It has benefits and costs, but I don't think there's any question that it's short-circuited the mechanisms that we normally have for how we decide to go to war, whether it's public debate, whether it's debate in Congress, whether it's media coverage. It's the idea of having a national discussion about whether to send troops, whether to wage war overseas or not, is something that in many ways is lacking in our discourse today. And the war that I've written a lot about, and we are going to talk primarily about tonight, is the war outside of the declared war zones, places like Pakistan, Yemen, parts of Africa, places where the contours of the conflict are not so well known as Iraq and Afghanistan, but are, I think, I would argue, just as central to the history of the last 15 years as what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, because it set so many new precedents and because it sort of established this new model for warfare. So what does this really look like, and what are we talking about when we talk about the shadow wars? On one hand, it's a war that's had impacts of blurring lines between what is traditionally work of the military and is traditionally work of the intelligence world. This shorthand way to look at it is, you could say, after 15 years, that over that time, the CIA has become to look a lot more like the Pentagon, and the Pentagon has come to look a whole lot more like the CIA. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a little bit. It's also, interestingly, a war that has largely been run by lawyers. And I don't know how many lawyers we have in the room tonight, or any aspiring lawyers, but if there are aspiring lawyers, I would argue that if you're going into the national security field and government, you're going to be well employed for years to come. So what do I mean by that? When 9/11, 2001 happened, what the United States could and could not do in this kind of war was largely a blank slate. And over the years, it got gradually filled in by the work of lawyers. So some of the most momentous and, I would argue, consequential decisions about detention, interrogation, torture, surveillance, assassination, effectively were made by groups of lawyers deciding where the lines were, what was legal and what was not legal, what fit into American law and what did not. And we have been reckoning with some of those decisions over the years. And it's hard to imagine that changing, because we are, as we speak, still deciding about new conflicts in new areas and how to detain people and whether to carry out drone strikes or not, and what extent the surveillance of the American public will be allowed. Should Apple give in to the FBI in the case of one iPhone of a San Bernardino terrorist? These are issues that stay with us and will stay with us. I think in order to describe a little bit about where we are, I think we should go back and talk about where things were 15 years ago. If we look at these organizations of the military and the intelligence community, but more specifically the CIA, where were they on September 11, 2001? Well, the CIA is, for those who know the history, is an organization with a history that is in many ways cyclical. The first few decades of the CIA saw an organization that was sent abroad to do all sorts of covert operations that nobody knew about, whether it was coup attempts, assassination plots, rigging of elections. These were things that American presidents sent the CIA to do because it was seen in the American interest. But it was not something that was anything that was discussed. It wasn't until the mid-1970s when a lot of this dirty laundry, for lack of a better term, got aired out. And in the mid-1970s, in the Church Committee investigations and the Pike Committee investigations, people learned what the CIA was doing and had done for so long. And that was something that really reshaped the CIA's mission. People who came in, there was a great, for lack of a better term, bloodletting at the CIA, where the people who had been involved in the operations for the first 30 years of the agency's existence basically were pushed out. And people who went into the agency in the late 70s were people who were basically told, and I'm of course simplifying to some degree, but that the agency's mission is to collect intelligence, analyze intelligence, to do espionage, to do less of covert action. And what happened was this generation of post-Church Committee officers came in, went through the ranks of the CIA, rose through the ranks of the CIA, and then by 9/11, by the year 2000 and 2001, had come into positions of significance and seniority in the CIA. And what happened was they were presented with this new weapon in 2000, 2001, at the same time that the threat of terrorism, specifically Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, came to the front. And that weapon was the Predator, the armed Predator drone. And what is interesting when you look back at this history, the CIA during this period of, especially the summer of 2001, just 2 months before the 9/11 attacks, there was this sort of morality play at the CIA about whether the CIA should even embrace this weapon, should take it on, whether the CIA should be killing people. It was seen as a weapon of assassination for an agency that was supposed to be out of the killing business. And this played out at the highest levels. George Tenet and others really questioned whether this is something the CIA should be doing. Well, 2 months later, 9/11 happens, and within a week, the CIA is given this broad new mission to go around the world to capture or kill al-Qaeda operatives, or anyone who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Hundreds of drone strikes later, it seems somewhat quaint to look back at this period of time and say the CIA was actually debating whether they should be doing drone strikes. But it's now something that's become ingrained in the fabric of the agency, an agency that's become increasingly militarized during this period of time, and one that I don't think is poised at all to give up that mission, in part for any sort of bureaucratic reasons, and also because I don't think this White House or a future White House is going to want them to give up that mission. So that's the CIA side of things. On the military side, launching these shadow wars, if you look at where things were on 9/11, the military was basically built as it had been for decades, to fight the Cold War, to basically fight a large Russian advance in Germany or whichever battlefield of the Cold War. They had done the Gulf War in the 90s, but it looked like it had for decades. And when 9/11 happens, senior leaders at the Pentagon, especially Donald Rumsfeld, basically said, we now are in this global war, and we have a military that doesn't have the authority or the capability to fight around the globe, in essence, in places where the United States is not at war. So what has happened over the last 15 years on the military side is breaking down the boundaries that existed in 2001 to allow the military to go to places where the United States hasn't even declared war. Places like Pakistan, places like Yemen, places like Somalia. And this is generally done in a clandestine capacity with special operations troops, with military drone strikes. The idea being that the military needs to gather intelligence in the way the CIA used to. And where the CIA is now a more militarized organization, on the other side of the coin is that the military is become far closer to the intelligence model because it's all about tracking, hunting, and killing people. That is kind of in a nutshell where we have seen this convergence come in the last 15 years. And when you look at places where it's played out, where have been the laboratories of these shadow wars? I think the number one laboratory, and one that I've written probably the most about, is Pakistan. Largely because it was seen right after September 11th as the place where if you were going into Afghanistan and the real threat it was not Afghanistan, it was really Pakistan, and yet the military couldn't go there, the CIA had restrictions, everyone converged on Pakistan to basically carry out this kind of shadow war. And that has had all sorts of fascinating, interesting history over the years. The most well-known episode is 10 years after 9/11, when a team of Navy SEALs go in May of 2011 to Abbottabad, Pakistan, and kill Osama bin Laden. And when you think about the convergence, as I just talked about, over 10 years, you have a team of Navy SEALs going into a country where the United States is not officially at war. They did so under authority that the CIA had. So these Navy SEALs, who are special operations troops of the American military, were put under CIA authority to do this mission because it could not be officially acknowledged. Of course, it was acknowledged soon afterwards. But it's just a sign of how easy it had become to go back and forth between these different roles. The lines had blurred so much during this period of time that nobody thought twice about having teams of Navy SEALs go under CIA authority and do this operation in a country where the United States had certainly not declared war. There were some obviously fascinating and consequential moments even before that raid. And when I was researching my book, when I went to Pakistan to do the research and realized, as an American, I was thinking that the Osama bin Laden raid had been the most important moment of U.S. Pakistani history in this post-9/11 period because it was the most consequential for us. But it was only in going to Pakistan that I realized that actually the really most important episode for the Pakistanis happened 3 months later. And that was in January 2011 when a man named Raymond Davis was driving through the streets of Lahore, Pakistan, and got caught in traffic. He was assaulted. He was approached by two men who carried guns, and he thought he was about to get robbed. He shot both men, one through the windshield and one as he was running away, and quickly realized that he had a problem. He radioed the American embassy for help, or the consulate in Lahore for help, and a truck came to help him out from the consulate. The truck went the wrong way down a one-way street and killed a third person in Lahore, and ultimately turned around, and Raymond Davis was left to the Lahore cops for interrogation. So why is this so significant? Well, Raymond Davis was working officially for the consulate in Lahore, but in fact he was working for the CIA. And what played out was this. All of the suspicions that Pakistan had about what the United States was doing, what the CIA was doing in Pakistan, and for those of you who've been to Pakistan know it's probably the world's most conspiratorial place, all of these conspiracies were confirmed by Raymond Davis sitting in a jail in Lahore. It didn't help that he had also worked for Blackwater, but that was sort of icing on the cake for the Pakistanis. And President Obama came out and asked for his release and said he was a diplomat and was entitled to diplomatic immunity. The Pakistanis knew otherwise. And there was ultimately a secret deal struck between the United States and Pakistan to get Raymond Davis out of jail to fly him to Afghanistan. But when I went to Pakistan, at this point, it was a year later, it was only then that I realized that this was used as the ultimate in a sort of rhetorical argument about the CIA, about these shadow wars, about what they were doing in Pakistan. Raymond Davis became the boogeyman for anyone who wanted to rail against what the United States or what the CIA was doing. And that's why in my book I spent a lot of time on the Raymond Davis case, because I thought it was so important, but I thought it was also indicative of how we now go to war. We go to war with people who in many cases are people who've worked in the private sector, private intelligence or private security firms, people who have special operations backgrounds who now go to the CIA or to the intelligence world. We're drawing people in a lot of different places, and it's not that this is a bad form of warfare as opposed to the other, but it's certainly a form of warfare that we haven't discussed as a country or really grappled with about whether, if this is the future, whether this is what we want the future to be. So now we are at a place where, in the last 2 years, an administration that had thought it would be the administration that was ending war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and other places, now has found that it is once again engaged in Iraq, and it's not leaving Afghanistan anytime soon. We also have American troops in North Africa, in West Africa, I said Afghanistan, and we've come to these sort of linguistic contortions about what it really means to deploy our military overseas. It was kind of illuminating when President Obama had said for some time that, we're not going to have boots on the ground in Syria. This was the talking point for the administration. And then it came out that the Pentagon was sending what they called, and what officially was referred to as, a specialized expeditionary targeting force. And President Obama was asked about what the specialized expeditionary targeting force was. And he sort of earnestly replied, well, when I said no boots on the ground, I think Americans really knew what I meant, which was, no big wars like we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that may be right. But at the same time, what it means is that we now have troops everywhere, either acknowledged or not. They're encountering the same risks. They are doing the same kind of lethal missions that those in Iraq and Afghanistan were doing, and yet we know very little about what they're doing. But I certainly think that this is a model that will continue. So back to this kind of seductive quality of warfare. It's very apparent that this president has truly embraced this type of shadow warfare, just like his predecessor, George W. Bush, did. And I think no matter how much bluster there is among those who want to replace President Obama, I'd be truly surprised if the next president, for all the reasons I just discussed, didn't act in very much the same way. Phil.
All right. Fantastic. This is an amazing privilege for me, really. First off, I'm the son of a Georgetown graduate, the grandson of a Georgetown graduate, the brother of a Georgetown graduate, so this is pretty cool. And as Mark mentioned, I went to the same high school, a Jesuit school, so that's where we were educated, if you choose to call it that. It was great. It's also just, it's amazing to be here with Mark. He's a journalist that I've admired for a long, long time. It's kind of weird to actually be doing an event with him. I've been reading him for a while. And, Scott Moyers, our editor, actually did the same thing to me. He came, he said, "You need to read this book," and he gave me the way a knife, which was really frustrating to me because I'd already bought it. And hardcovers are expensive. I think that Mark is one of the few journalists who are really essential to read, to understand what our country is doing, what it means. Reading him, I've often, wondered not just how he gets his access, but how he gets his skill at storytelling, how he gets the moral vision to infer that, to be able to inform us, the American citizenry, of the things that we truly need to know. I assume he got that from the Jesuits. They don't let you leave without it. So I'll just tell you some stories that I think maybe are relevant. So in November 2009, in Paktika province, Afghanistan, a civilian with a prosthetic leg showed up at one of the 1st Battalion 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment's combat outposts, asking to speak to the commander. "I think there was a misunderstanding," he told an infantry officer by the name of Nate Bethea, a friend of mine. What had happened was Navy SEALs had raided his home and shot his father, who survived, only to be loaded onto a helicopter and taken away. Now he had no idea where his father was or how to find him. "Okay," Bethea said, "tell me about your father." The man explained that his father is 85 years old, that in addition to shooting him, they'd killed 4 other people, some of them as old as the man's father. Bethea had heard this kind of story before, offered his apologies, tracked down the hospital where they had the man's father, and sent him on his way. Then he looked into the man's story. The raid, it turns out, was a legitimate target. There was a Taliban sub-governor in that room. Outside the room had 2 Taliban fighters in tactical vests with AKs. The SEALs had taken them out, gone into the room, and in the confusion killed not only the Taliban, but also several very old men, and they'd shot this one guy's father. Now, I don't want to suggest we should judge the SEALs too harshly. Consider how dangerous and confusing it must be to rush into a room filled with men, some armed, some not. But at the end of the day, they shot unarmed old men, and then they flew away. America's shadow warriors have that luxury. But since this was Afghanistan, not Yemen or Syria or Pakistan or some other place where we don't have ground forces, it wasn't just angry civilians left in the area. The 1st Battalion, 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment was there as well, doing daily patrols through the towns and countryside of Paktika province, meeting with village elders, trying to make friends and form alliances. They were the local unit, the landowner, as it's called in the military. And because they were there were Americans there to ask, was this raid worth it? And there were Americans who had to go out the next day As Bethea told me, so there I am, trying to pitch a notion of Jeffersonian democracy to Afghans, and having to say, yeah, we're all about transparency and rule of law, and that's why these shadow ninjas just killed your family and there's nothing anybody can do about it. That raid, and a subsequent one in which the SEALs killed a 15-year-old boy with a muscular degenerative disease, eventually led the battalion commander, Colonel Baker, to demand greater restrictions on the SEALs' operations in his area for the very simple reason that an overly aggressive posture was making his mission harder. And his mission was the main effort, theoretically. The point here is not to cast aspersions on the SEALs, or to suggest that these types of raids always involve civilian casualties. Usually, these raids can greatly help local commanders. But the point is that to the SEALs and to their higher headquarters, that raid was a success. They'd killed a Taliban sub-governor. Undoubtedly, they gathered intelligence that led them to other Taliban fighters. And yes, some old guys died, but what were they doing hanging out with a Taliban sub-governor in the first place? Be careful of the company you keep. And because those SEALs weren't on the ground day in and day out, working in the towns, talking with the people, they were shielded from the second and third order effects of that raid, the effects that that local unit, the landowner, was extremely conscious of. Now, this sort of problem can occur even in cases where there are no civilian casualties. Nobody is in favor of civilian casualties. But let me tell you another story. October 2005, Delta Force swept into Fallujah on Black Hawk helicopters and picked up a woman named Sarah al-Jumaili, who they knew had links to Zarqawi, the founder of monotheism and jihad, which later became al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is now ISIS. He was arguably the most dangerous terrorist insurgent in Iraq at the time. It was a clean mission. Delta's very good. They located her, blindfolded her, bound her hands, and flew her to a base outside of the area to interrogate her. The problem was, local Fallujans really didn't like the idea of Americans bursting into a home in the middle of the night and taking one of their women. The worst sorts of conspiracy theories swirled around Fallujah. And it wasn't Delta that had to deal with the aftermath. It was the local Marine unit. Making matters worse, what happened didn't happen without any warning for the local Marines. Cale Weston, the State Department's political advisor in the region, later wrote, all our hard work, working with local leaders and sheikhs, all our hard work began to disintegrate based on a decision the Marines and I had no input on whatsoever. We were Fallujah's full-time residents and most knowledgeable about the various sticky webs of egos, deceit, and vendettas layered and intertwined within the city. The detention risked becoming the ideal flashpoint extremists needed. Weston ended up sending an email to General Casey, the highest-ranking general in Iraq at the time. He wrote to him, if Sarah al-Jumaili is not released before Friday prayers, Marines and civilians will die. General Casey sided with the Marines, reached out to JSOC, and they got her released. Why does this matter? It matters because kill capture missions are a tool we are increasingly relying on, whether it's on raids like the one I just described, or whether it's on drone strikes, which are really just another tool in the arsenal of the same targeting system. And we're increasingly relying on them in places where we don't have ground forces of the sort to clue us in on the second and third order effects of what we're doing. We don't have Cale Weston telling us that we need to release that prisoner, or Colonel Baker demanding fewer civilian casualties. Instead, we have reports telling us the mission was a success. Bad guys captured or killed, and who wouldn't be for that? In the abstract, these sorts of missions seem like a win-win. They're cheaper than counterinsurgency, and they manage to regularly kill or capture truly evil people. The problem is that these things are never so simple. The moral clarity that they seem to promise is not possible in war. Mark has spoken eloquently of why these missions are so tempting to political leaders, but it's important to realize that they're tempting to soldiers and to the general public as well. I know a Marine who's one of those honest-to-goodness, genuine American heroes, Jake Cusack, a decorated Marine. If any of you have seen American Sniper, you'll remember The Butcher, who's based on a real insurgent operating in Fallujah, a guy responsible for the murder and torture of dozens of Fallujahs. Jake is the guy who ultimately captured him. Jake told me, we wanted a worthy enemy, worthy of our lives, worthy of our deaths, so desperately that we played up any intelligence that indicated a torture house, a foreign fighter, a Chechen sniper, anything dramatic enough to deserve us. He wanted the sort of war promised him in the movies, in other words. And Jake almost had it. Not only did he capture the Butcher, but when the journalist Jill Carroll was kidnapped in Iraq, his unit ended up tracking down her kidnappers, catching them, and gathering the intelligence needed to find her. After she was released, CNN ran stories about Cusack, lauding him as a hero. The strange thing about being a hero, though, was that it made it harder for him to talk with folks back home. He later wrote of the experience, I didn't feel like telling the truth, that violence was increasing every month we were there, that I wasn't sure what we had accomplished, that one night before a mission, one of my snipers asked me, if I die here tomorrow, could you really tell my mom I died for my country? The hostage story was simple, straightforward, just enough information to feed people who wanted to show they cared. Who wouldn't want a simple, straightforward story with a clear villain and a clear victory after so many years of murky warfare? I know a Marine who on his 4th deployment met a group of Afghans who at first assumed he was Russian. This was in 2009. After he explained he was an American, they asked, why are you here? Well, he said there were some very bad people in Afghanistan. They flew planes into our buildings and the buildings fell down, so we're here. And then he gave up trying to explain it. Some soldiers have taken an even more bitter approach. Like the Marine in Sangin province telling Bing West, this war is stupid. Well, so what? Our country's in it. Even officers who supposedly are more connected to policy than the average soldier, these attenuated wars make the clarity of purpose battle is supposed to provide a little harder to find. There's a professor at West Point, Elizabeth Samet, who's written that given the lack of exit strategy and the apparent absence of a clear and consistent political vision guiding the war effort, it's forced many of the platoon leaders and company commanders I know to understand the dramas in which they found themselves as local and individual, rather than national or communal. The ends they furnish for themselves, coming home without losing any soldiers, or if someone has to die, doing so heroically in battle, offer exclusively personal and particular consolations that make the mission itself effectively beside the point. I know Marines who deployed to Afghanistan purely to look out for their brothers. I know one Marine who had the experience of his friend had died saving his life in Iraq. And he chose to volunteer. He moved earth and heaven to get to a unit that was going to Afghanistan where he knew the fighting would be. And when I asked him why, his explanation had nothing to do with geopolitics. He told me that he knew what it was like to have a friend die and then have to go out the next day and the next day and the next day. And he knew that the units going to Afghanistan in 2009, they'd probably face the same issue. That was where the fighting was. And he said, I've got experience. I think I can help these guys. He died in an IED in late 2009. Perhaps that's why commando-style raids are so appealing. And perhaps that's why they've captured the imagination of the American public. The majority of special operations missions are actually about supervising, training, and assisting local forces. One of the most successful recent uses of special forces, our support to the Colombian military in their fight against the FARC, was a mission in which our operators were not allowed to fight alongside the Colombian troops they'd trained. And yet missions like that aren't particularly sexy, and they certainly don't make it to the camera. So what does make it to the camera? Zero Dark 30, 13 Hours, and especially American Sniper are our current pop culture offerings for processing the past 15 years. And they all offer a vision of war in which highly trained operatives kill undoubtedly evil people. Bomb makers, torturers, sadists, thugs of all stripes, without forcing too much consideration about the overall outcome. In a raid, the moral stakes seem clear. Let's only think about the butcher, or the evil enemy sniper, or Osama bin Laden, and not about the chaos rolling around them. After the release of Rambo 2, the Vietnam veteran and author Gustav Hasford, who wrote The Short Timers, which Full Metal Jacket is based on, he reviewed the film for Penthouse. Yeah. He didn't like it. He wrote, "Rambo satisfies our pathetic need to win the war and gives us another coat of whitewash as bumbling do-getters, innocent American white bread boys pulled down into corruption by wicked Orientals. We should have won. We could have won," Rambo argues, "if only the dumb grunts could have been saved by grotesquely muscled civilians who somehow skidded the shooting war. We're the same age, Sly." Pop culture has gotten savvier since then. American Sniper, after all, has the veneer of nonfiction. Some of the parts of the film are actually quite good. But the Iraq It showed me a place in which a solid majority of even the young children in the film are actively engaged in trying to kill American troops is not the Iraq I remembered. And it's not the Iraqi people I remembered. When they screened the film in Baghdad, Iraqis threw shoes at the screen. And I understand why. If you narrow your scope sufficiently, there's no end to what you don't have to think about. Unless, of course, you're still living in Baghdad. And if you're living in America, you're not likely to get that perspective either. You're not even that likely to know a soldier, because it's an all-volunteer military. And even if you do know a soldier, you're probably not likely to know a special operator or a drone pilot. So that makes it a lot easier to think of them in the abstract, or even as celebrities. And that allows us to not think about them as people doing a job for us. Perhaps that's why, in the last State of the Union address, President Obama told the nation, to great applause, "If you doubt America's commitment, or mine, to see that justice is done, just ask Osama bin Laden." Remember that? Remember that guy we killed? That was a victory, right? That was something the whole country could get around. It felt like catharsis. It felt like an ending, didn't it? How many years ago was that? Thank you.
Mark and Phil have agreed to do a Q&A with the audience. If you have questions, please direct them to our speakers.
Yeah, here's a brain teaser for you. If you were one of the leaders of the terrorist group and your men were being the victims of targeted assassinations, how would you respond? And if you're attacked, you try and respond in kind. Now, they can't send drones over here, but they could send a lone assassin. He wouldn't even need to bring his own gun. It's not that hard to get a gun in this country. And he wouldn't be that hard to assassinate somebody. John Brennan, when he was National Security Advisor, would open his own front door. General Michael Hayden was jogging on the W.O.D. Trail in Virginia, I attended an event with Jay Johnson where I didn't have to walk through a metal detector. I was seated 6 feet from him. So why have they? You think they've tried this and got intercepted long before they got to this country? Or why haven't they tried this? And if they did try it, do you think that might radically affect our drone policy, our targeted assassination policy?
So it's it's unclear exactly how much this policy we've been pursuing, what the blowback is going to be, right? What is the impact of a drone policy, a targeted assassination policy? What is that going to mean in the future? We certainly are seeing with the rise of ISIS the growth of groups that will want to do violence and to kill Americans and Westerners wherever they can. Your question about whether it could happen in the United States is that, so there's two real issues in my mind. It's now harder to get into the United States and to carry out an attack like 9/11 than it ever has been in history. And it probably, knock on wood, it probably would be nearly impossible to do something similar to 9/11 today. That doesn't mean then that you couldn't have a mass shooting, another terrorist attack like San Bernardino quite easily. You just said it's very easy to get a gun here. All you would need would be to have people who might be somewhat inclined inside the United States to carry out such an attack, get a gun, and do it. The ability for people to be radicalized by social media or whatever kind of, or whatever other way, it's there. So that then means the United States, the government has to think about things entirely differently than they had been doing, and it doesn't mean just shutting the borders, shutting the airports, making sure that terrorists don't get in. It's also making sure you understand how people might get radicalized in this country, because the real acts of violence that have been carried out in the name of ISIS or whatever haven't been from people who have come to this country. It's been from people who have been inside the country and have been radicalized here.
Yeah. There was also something interesting to me, like when San Bernardino happened, it wasn't clear what had happened. There was is this a domestic shooting, like Newtown, in which it has no implications for policy at all? Or is it, somebody associated with Islam, in which case it totally changes everything, right? There's no such thing as perfect security, and I think that the attempt to achieve it probably makes us less safe. What do I mean by that? So I was in Iraq during the search, and one of the counterinsurgency manual had these kind of like Zen koan suggestions for forces, and one of them was like the more like force protection you have, the less safe you are, the less secure you are, right? And what they were trying to say was that true security is actually dependent upon a certain degree of social norms, right? Or relationship with the local community. If people in a local community in an insurgency are on your side and willing to give you information, insurgents can't exist there. So once the Anbar Awakening happened, I don't want to get into the politics of the surge and whether it worked or not, but once the Anbar Awakening happened and local leaders in Anbar province started assisting U.S. forces, there was a period of a lot of violence, and then the violence dropped off a cliff, right? And so, yeah, in an open society, there's always a risk, right? And it's not something that you can eliminate. And I think the desire to eliminate it actually makes you more dangerous. It actually makes it more dangerous for you because you sort of eliminate the things about a society that makes it strong.
Yeah.
This is why Donald Trump would be a bad president.
Yes.
Two questions. One is, and this kind of goes to your point about lawyers fighting everything out. What do you think about the iPhone, Apple battle versus the government? And the second question, and you don't have to answer both, you can just do one, is what about Edward Snowden and the Citizen Forum movie? Either one.
You covering this one, or am I?
Yeah. I think the Apple battle
Snowden,
is probably
Snowden
not.
and Apple. Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's an issue. There's an issue when everything is classified and everything is overclassified, right? And I think there's also an issue where whenever you have a whistleblower, like whistleblowers are never perfect, right? Would I personally have released everything that Edward Snowden released? No. I think there's people who have a good reason to be upset with some of the things that he released. But when a guy is looking at the head of the NSA lying to Congress about what we're doing, there are things that in a democracy I think that we need to discuss. And I think that's also part of this discussion, right? So in terms of war policy, we haven't had an authorization of military force in over a decade, right? Because nobody in Congress wants to be Hillary Clinton right now, who has to justify her vote for the Iraq War, a war that had over 70% approval ratings at the time. It's much easier to just cede everything to the executive, right? And then there's so much less accountability and so much less risk. It's Congress's job. So I think that there's with Snowden. There are many reasons that people feel very justified in being angry with some of the things that he released. But the problem is he had really good reasons for wanting to release some things. And there are things that he released that sparked debates that we really should be having as a society. If you're waiting for a perfect whistleblower, that's not what you get. If you have a system that really demands whistleblowers, you're not always going to get somebody who releases exactly the right amount of information.
Yeah, just two things. I think to Phil's first point about the authorization that we have now to wage war, I think it's we're relying on this thing that was done in the first week after the September 11th attacks, the first authorization for use of military force, which has become this kind of Greek mythology monster that we've stuck a head of an ISIS onto a body of a Al Qaeda and a Taliban, and it's now used to justify absolutely everything, and it's done, as Phil said, because Congress doesn't want to deal with it. They just don't want to have to address and give the president the authority to deal with the threats as they change. Nobody who covers this stuff or lives this stuff or follows it or who lives in these places would say that ISIS in Syria is just like the Al-Qaeda as it existed on 9/11 in Afghanistan. It's a totally different organization, and yet we're fighting them based on the same authorization. And I think that's, to some degree, it's a mythology that continues that is done because nobody really wants to deal with the central issue. On the point of Snowden, I think I'd largely agree with Phil on the point that it's. I think that the very first thing that came out of the Snowden disclosures is the most important, and sort of it declined and went downhill from there. But the first disclosure of this collection of information of U.S. Metadata on phones that was then stored for some future purpose, that was an important disclosure that even the head of the intelligence apparatus says, yeah, we should have made that public. We should have had a discussion about that. It was stupid to keep that secret, and it Snowden had to come along to do that. And have that debate about what do we want as a country? Do we want to have our phone call information captured and stored, or do we not want it? And if we do want it, we should discuss it and agree that this is something that we want. It should not be something that is decided in secret and then done, and then because of inertia continues.
Two questions. One is a follow-on with Snowden. Don't you think there's a difference, though, between Snowden giving to journalists the documents and journalists sifting through them and seeing that something that's legitimate to raise, like the metadata, versus something that was the congressional budget analysis of the NSA, the CIA, and those documents that said what we were doing right and what we were doing wrong, that basically gives a terrorist a roadmap to that data, which I gather from reading the New York Times is something that really is a real violation of national security. That's question one. And two, doesn't it appear that we don't seem to be learning very many lessons from what we continually do? We go into Iraq in 2003. We don't seem to learn very many lessons. Charlie Wilson's war, we go into Afghanistan, and then we leave all these weapons there that they get used by the Taliban and the Biden to kill all these people. We just seem to be making things worse. Does anyone seem to ever be learning anything from this, or do you see this just getting over and over and over? I mean, I really, it just seems like it's going on and nobody seems to learn anything.
Should do this like WWF when I'm stumped by a question and just, help me learn. Yeah, there is a difference, and this is why, I made the point about you never get a perfect whistleblower, right? But hopefully you create the conditions where they're not sort of gross violations that would really impel somebody to start releasing things.
But a journalist who then takes those documents, like Salon.com, isn't really responsible.
I think they're responsible, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
You don't think that they should have?
I think I think there. I mean, everything needs to be judged on a case-by-case basis, right? But like Mark said, I think there were definitely things that were important for us as a country to talk about. As to whether we've learned things, some people have learned things. I think there are a lot of there are a lot of people in government and out of it who are trying very hard to find better ways to come at these problems. You wouldn't know it from the current presidential debate. I have a maybe Pollyannish faith that sort of in the long term we slowly learn lessons. I was talking with Mark earlier about how, if you look at past conflicts, this sort of history makes you vaguely optimistic, if only because things were so bad in the past. Our ability to learn, the lessons is always far, far too slow, and there's always far, far too many reasons to set aside the lessons that we really want to learn or really should learn, because that would involve taking a very hard look in the mirror. And, who wants to do that in the wake of a pretty disastrous war?
Just on the first point about information disclosures, I would draw a distinction between just having a lot of information that you dump out as opposed to having a lot of information that you give to the New York Times, and you can then have people sift through it.
Why do you choose that example?
I just pulled it out of the air, and to be able to sift through and decide what in the considered judgment of a lot of people is newsworthy and important, and not just spilling secrets for the sake of spilling secrets. I mean, we are always going to err on the side of having more disclosures rather than less. But I think there's a distinction between the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, large news organizations, and WikiLeaks, which is, we have a lot of information here, you, the public, just make sense of it without any real determination about what harm it's going to cause, versus here, you news organizations, here's a lot of information, make sense of it. And we've dealt with this a lot for the last 5 or 6 years, whether it's with WikiLeaks or others. We saw information in WikiLeaks, which was for us quite an important trove of information that was really newsworthy. But there was a lot of information that we saw in there that was not newsworthy, and if we just put it out into the public, it would actually get people killed without any news value. So, it's, I guess, an infomercial for news judgment, but I think there's still value in that.
One more? Yeah,
one more.
You pick.
Who wants to be the last? Right here. Okay.
Cool. Hi. So do you see current military action as a positive and sustainable influence on national security? If not, what steps can policymakers take in order to make military action a more positive influence on national security?
Well, what do you mean by positive influence on national security?
Do you see the military action as outlined, both covert and covert military action? Do you see that as playing a sustainable role in national security?
I think that, so we've had, let's just take the last 15 years, right? So the experience has been, we've had September 11th, 2001, and the urge was, okay, we have to go big and do this in a military fashion without necessarily thinking too much about it. And then we had the Afghanistan and the Iraq experience, and then that was the searing experience for many. And then the sort of feeling was then we have to go back. The pendulum swings the other way, where we can have no military engagement except for the sort of covert engagement. I think it continues to remain, especially on the covert side, so seductive, as both Phil and I talked about, because you don't have to answer for it, right? You're still committing troops, you're still putting them at risk, and yet it's not necessarily in the public, it's not in the news, you're not seeing hundreds, dozens of troops dying, and so it's not something that you as a politician have to answer for. I think from my point of view, it is problematic for national security only if it becomes the default solution that is the solution that seems like the easiest thing to do because we don't know of any other solution. I also think, though, that we can become so hamstrung by the prospect of committing troops that sometimes it is the right thing to do, and we are thinking so much about our past experiences that we won't do it. I think, first and foremost, though, I'm really some of the loose rhetoric, some of the what we hear during the presidential campaigns about sending troops in, about making the sand glow by bombing, which is reckless, which is idiotic, which has no basis in any reality. That's where I think it's harmful.
Yeah. Bob Gates at a recent event said a third grader should be embarrassed by the level of foreign policy discussion in the current presidential race. I think there are cases where it's done really well, and there are cases where it's done really poorly. I think a lot about process, right? Is going in this case right, or is going in this case wrong? But there's another question, which is about the process by which we decide to do these sorts of things, right? How easy we have made it to push that button. And I think that it's not as maybe exciting to talk about process versus talking about individual engagements or individual choices. But that's something that we really need to consider about the way that we use military force and the way that we excuse ourselves, excuse legislators, and excuse the general public from having to think really hard about the kinds of choices that we're making. So, yeah. All right.
We're here for a little while.
This is one of the most thought-provoking and intense discussions we've had as Library Associate participants. I think what Mark Mazzetti and Phil Klay have done has been very gutsy to come and talk to us, to write, to engage with the community at large about the issues that they see are critical to what we're thinking about. So join me once again in thanking Mark Mazzetti and Phil Klay. Join me also, please, once again, in thanking Bobby and Herb Gstalder for endowing the lecture series that brings great people like Mark Mazzetti and Phil Klay to Georgetown. There's something else I'd like to invite you to join us in, and that is the campaign for Georgetown, which ends June 30th of this year. The library is a proud part of the Georgetown campaign for generations to come. We are able to bring people like Mark and Phil here. We are able to provide students and faculty at Georgetown with the sort of information that Mark said has to be sifted through. We, with our expertise in the library, help people discern what is junk, what is crucial, and what is truly helpful to people's research. You can't do that without a lot of support. The Gstalters have given us an endowment to support thought-provoking programs like this so that we can continue with the life of the mind beyond the classroom. Join us in the campaign and join us for a reception immediately following this presentation. Thank you very, very much for coming.